The following is an interview with Dr. Bernie Dodge, Professor of Educational Technology and creator of the WebQuest model. His interviewer is Dr. James Frazee, Director of Instructional Technology Services, San Diego State University.
What is a WebQuest?
Well, the short definition is that a WebQuest is simply good teaching with the web. But being a professor, of course, there's a longer definition. So I would say the longer definition is first that it's a constructivist lesson format, that it's wrapped around a doable and interesting task that is ideally a scaled-down version of something that adults do, that it's a lesson in which most of the material that the learners deal with comes from the web, although not necessarily all. It's a lesson format in which you don't have kids searching for information; you have them using it. So they don't use Google very often. The resources are pre-selected by the teacher or designer who put the WebQuest together. Often, but not always, students, learners take on roles while going through a WebQuest because that allows them to see the situation or the problem through different perspectives and different roles. But the critical attribute of a WebQuest is that it involves higher level thinking.
Well, where did this idea come from?
Well, it came in a fit of panic in 1995 when I was preparing a class for pre-service teachers. I did a WebQuest about a program called Archetype, and it just went so well that I decided right then and there that I want to do this more often. So I gave it a name. I put up a web page in which I described the idea, and people began to find it, and soon the idea just took off like crazy. But it really started here in North Education.
Right here at San Diego State.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what assumptions about teaching and learning is the WebQuest model based upon?
Well, I assume that authentic tasks are more engaging. Kids from the beginning of schooling right through grad school have had more than enough textbook problems that aren't really part of the real world and are inauthentic. So that using the World Wide Web allows us to bring in real problems with real data about real people and places. I'm also assuming that learning is enhanced by social interaction among learners, that we learn when we think out loud, when we argue with each other, when we have to correct each other's mistakes and listen to each other. So that learning alone is less effective than learning in groups. I assume also that higher level thinking is such a critical skill, such a critical attribute in a world that changes every 10 minutes, that we need to develop it as early as possible. And that's why WebQuests are applicable down to about third grade or so. And another assumption I make that's sort of baked into the format itself is that uncertainty is not always a bad thing, that a certain amount of uncertainty and doubt is instructionally useful. So a good WebQuest is one in which the learners are given a problem that initially seems out of their reach and may seem sort of doubtful that they could ever complete it. But then you throw enough support at them so that they can do that. These ideas aren't new. They go back quite a ways. They are sort of a repackaging of or an operationalization of the thoughts of John Dewey and Lev Vygotsky. The other sort of assumption that guided WebQuest design was that I think it's better to be evolutionary in this case than revolutionary. That I wanted a format that would actually be used by people. I mean, I can imagine, so could a lot of people, ways to teach that are just so cutting edge and sort of out of the ordinary that would be hard to implement anywhere else. So I deliberately sort of tempered it down a bit so that it was semi-familiar and so that more teachers would adopt it. And that has turned out to be the case.
Yeah. So again, maybe there's an example that illustrates some of these ideas.
Yeah, let me show you this example that was developed by 3 students who I didn't teach here at San Diego State about the Berlin Wall. And the idea is that instead of treating the Berlin Wall and that period of history as just isolated facts, that the users of this lesson will act as if they were people living in East Berlin and West Berlin, and they'll work together in pairs, creating what are called parallel diaries. And they'll coordinate with each other so that they're covering all that was important about life in Berlin in that time period, and looking for the similarities and differences in their stories as they write 7 days in the life of somebody in Berlin during the Berlin crisis. So if you go through the WebQuest, you see that it comes with predetermined, pre-selected good resources that are readable by kids for whom this was intended. This, I believe, is a high school WebQuest. And that they are given explicit directions on what the deliverable is, and explained, they're explained what a parallel diary is. And the designers of this WebQuest put in some constraints around it, saying, you know, we want you to talk about the city conditions, we want you to talk about food and family and the checkpoints and all of the sort of fine points of what life in Berlin was like at that point, to make sure that they cover those bases. And then to sort of wrap it up, they also study the graffiti that covered the Berlin Wall, and they make up their own example of it. So I can imagine a classroom where this happened, having construction paper all along one wall with graffiti created by the kids. That's not just off the top of their head. It has to be authentically like the graffiti that covered the Berlin Wall. So after looking at this WebQuest, there's some things you ought to notice. One is that there's a standard set of parts of a WebQuest. It always begins with an introduction, followed by a description of the task, the end result of what the learners will do, and then step by step the process by which you accomplish the task. And then there's an evaluation section and a separate teacher page. But the critical thing is that the task has to involve higher level thinking skills. This is not a place for cutting and pasting encyclopedia entries. This is a task that requires making the information your own, transforming it into some new form. And it's, I would say it's a characteristic of WebQuest is that it walks that tightrope between structure and freedom, that there's enough constraint around it so that learners have to learn what you want them to learn, but they're given enough freedom that they can make the information their own.
Well, where can we find some more examples?
I maintain a site at webquest.org/search, where we have a database of over 2,000 WebQuests that's constantly being added to and deleted from, and I think that's the best place to start to find out more. There's also webquest.sdsu.edu, which is where you can find more information about writing WebQuests and what the underlying philosophy is, and articles, research articles about them.